Tuesday, February 20, the Lord's Test. Read Psalm 81, verses 7 and 8, 95, verses 7 to 11, 105, verses 17 to 22. What does divine testing involve in these texts? First of all, Psalm 81, verses 7 to 8. You called in trouble, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Selah. Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you, O Israel, if you will listen to me. And Psalm 95, verses 7 to 11. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness. When your fathers tested me, they tried me, though they saw my work. For 40 years I was grieved with that generation, and said, it is a people who go astray in their hearts, and they do not know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. And Psalm 105, beginning at verse 17. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with fetters. He was laid in irons until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people let him go free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions, to bind his princes at his pleasure and teach his elders wisdom. Meribah is a place where Israel tested God by challenging his faithfulness and power to provide for their needs, as we read in Exodus 17, verses 1 to 7. Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. So Moses said to them, Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, Why is it that you have brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, Go on before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? And then Psalm 95, verses 8 and 9, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. The Lord says, Don't harden your hearts, as Israel did at Meribah, as they did at Massah in the wilderness. For there your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw everything I did. Psalm 81 makes an intriguing reversal and interprets the same event as the time when God tested Israel in Psalm 81, verse 7, and by their disobedience and lack of trust, in verse 11, the people failed God's test. The reference to Meribah conveys a twofold message. First, God's people must not repeat the mistakes of past generations. Instead, they are to trust God and walk in his way, as we read in Psalm 81 and verse 13. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. Second, although the people failed the test, God came to their rescue when they were in trouble. We read in verse 7, God's saving grace in the past gives an assurance of God's grace to new generations. Psalm 105 shows that the trials were God's means of testing Joseph's trust in God's foretelling of his future. As we read in Genesis 37, 5-10, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding the sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood up around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And Psalm 105, verses 19-22, until the time that his word came to pass, the word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people let him go free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions, to bind his princes at his pleasure, and teach his elders wisdom. The Hebrew sarap, T-S-A-R-A-P, tested, in verse 19, conveys a sense of purging, refining, or purifying. Thus, the goal of God's testing of Joseph's faith was to remove any doubt in God's promise and to strengthen Joseph's trust in God's guidance. The goal of divine discipline is to strengthen God's children and to prepare them for the fulfillment of the promise as shown in Joseph's example in verses 20-22 that we've just read. However, rejection of God's instruction results in growing stubbornness and hardening of an obstinate person's heart. Ellen White wrote in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 146, God requires prompt and unquestioning obedience of his law, but men are asleep or paralyzed by the deceptions of Satan, who suggests excuses and subterfuges and conquers their scruples, saying as he said to Eve in the garden, "You shall not surely die." Disobedience not only hardens the heart and conscience of the guilty one, but it tends to corrupt the faith of others. That which looked very wrong to them at first gradually loses this appearance by being constantly before them, till finally they question whether it is really sin and unconsciously fall into the same error. End of quote. And so to finish today, what has been your own experience with how sin hardens the heart? Why should that thought drive us to the cross, where we can find the power to obey? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.